it's one of the biggest tasks he has, and I would expect he's working on it.
What recommendation do you have to the Prime Minister to ensure that Western voices are represented in Cabinet?
Oh, well, he will make sure that will be done. He will make sure. How it will be done, it will be decided by the Prime Minister and the group around him, and that will happen.
Well, we'll find out if it happens 2 weeks from tomorrow. That's when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will unveil his new cabinet. And we've learned some new intel on what to expect. First, a senior Liberal source says there is no guarantee that all re-elected ministers will return to cabinet, and that could mean some surprises. But sources say Bill Morneau is very likely to remain Minister of Finance. Trudeau, meanwhile, is still working out how to ensure Saskatchewan and Alberta are properly represented at the cabinet table after the Liberals failed to win any seats in those provinces. So it's a delicate task, and just how delicate is it? David McLaughlin has helped compose cabinets for former Prime Minister Kim Campbell and Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister. He joins us from Winnipeg. Michelle Cadario has helped compose cabinets for former Prime Minister Paul Martin and former BC Premier Christy Clark. She joins us from Toronto. Welcome to you both.
Hi. Thank you. Nice to see you.
I have put together an IKEA cabinet, which may be harder than putting together some political cabinets. But Michelle, I'd like to start with you. What sort of factors come into play when deciding how to fill out an inner circle?
Well, it's tough, and really you're doing something on a parallel track, because not only are you figuring out who the bodies are and the MPs that you want to lift up into cabinet, but you're also figuring out what your actual machinery of government looks like. Like, what does your ministry structure look like? And so typically, as I've done it, we worked on a parallel path, putting together what we want the ministries to look like, and then as you do that, talking about the individuals that are going to be right for those roles. Then you have to layer in gender parity, and then regional sensitivities, make sure that it's a diverse cabinet, and on top of that, you need to consider fluency and who has proficiency in both languages and who doesn't, and sometimes that matters in different roles, and sometimes you want to pair a unilingual minister with a bilingual parliamentary secretary, and so it's a real matching exercise that takes some time to put together right.
And David, you have to layer on top of all of those considerations that Michelle laid out, the fact that this is a minority versus a majority. So how does that change your thinking going into something like this?
Because it's 2019, right? We can't say it's 2015 anymore. I mean, these are radically different circumstances for the Prime Minister compared to last time out. And in fact, his last foray into cabinet shuffling didn't exactly turn up roses either, with the Jody Wilson-Raybould and debacle. So, this is really a whole different environment for him. Minority parliaments mean you got to stay close to home, and you tend to think more about your domestic performers, and your better political performers for your top portfolios, because you're going to be in the House perhaps more. You're going to be under that kind of scrutiny. You don't have the same kind of luxuries as you had before, because you could be into an election at any time. So you're not just pushing your own agenda forward. You're also setting the ground for your own re-election and a potential campaign that you might want to pull yourself. So it's a very different set of dynamics. This time, Mr. Trudeau has, of course, Western alienation issues and lack of cabinet representation. He lost some members that he may have wanted to put in cabinet, or at least have that kind of flexibility. Very different dynamic, and a government that has not exactly been stellar on achieving its agenda. So he's got some real thinking to do along the lines of what Michelle's talking about. What are they going to try to do with this government? Put your best performers in there and drive the agenda along. So he's going to need this next 2 weeks.
Michelle, I want you to pick up on that point, talking about the domestic agenda and keeping your best people close to home, because one of their best people has been Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland. And what we're hearing now from senior Liberals is that they may want to deploy that skill set domestically and use it not in the foreign affairs portfolio. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Well, there's no doubt that Chrystia Freeland is a clutch player, and she would excel probably in any ministerial portfolio. And I completely agree with David that the priorities of who and what ministers become most important shift when you're in a minority government. The finance minister is critical. They're the ones that are going to have to be crafting a budget, and they're going to have to be working with the opposition parties. And that is a whole different ballgame. And so, there is something to be said for having some experience there. where you're not learning how a budget is put together, but you're just trying to figure out how to incorporate the opposition members in it. And then the House Leader. That is what I would say is the second most important minister in this new Parliament, because in a minority, understanding the procedures of the House, working with all the other House leaders, actually moving your legislation through and being able to demonstrate to Canadians that you got some things accomplished and done is incredibly challenging. And so you need somebody who is very savvy and who is good at communication and good at relationships to fill that role.
David, on that point, we're getting a lot of indications that Bill Morneau is likely staying put. They want to send a message to markets of stability, and they think he's doing a good job in the economy. What do you think of that move, and who do you think would be a good pick for House Leader?
Let me start with finance. I was Jim Flaherty's chief of staff during the first Harper minority government, and what Michelle says is quite true in terms of committees and the role of committees and the reports, for example, that they put out. Flaherty was assiduous in paying attention to the work of the Finance Committee and finding ways to incorporate it into his budgets and into decisions of the Finance Department, so as a way to prolong the minority, of course, and and lessen some of the tension there. Mr. Morneau has had a bit of a checkered history as finance minister. His communication skills are not the strongest, but he knows the brief, and he would retaining him would not be terribly surprising given the bit of the record that they've had, and you think about who else you can go to. So it's for me it's a key portfolio that will help determine sort of the tenor of what they want to do, including their first agenda items. And we've heard some talk about moving on tax cuts. Mm-hmm. So that would probably that puts Morneau in the spotlight right away.
But Michelle, who would you pick for House Leader? Who would be a good person? There's been some suggestion maybe Jeff Regan comes out of the Speaker's chair. He could be someone with some experience and knowledge to do that.
Well, Jeff would be a good choice for sure. I think that it's important for the person to actually, if possible, be fairly close to Ottawa because they are going to be spending a lot of time there. And so just that makes it would make it very hard for a BC MP, for example, to be the House Leader because you're so tied to Ottawa. Being fluently bilingual is also critical. And what I would say as well is that you want someone who has been around for a while. There's not a lot of folks who were around in the minority days in 2004 to 2006 when we were in government, but there are a few. And then there's also some who were kind of around around Ottawa at that time, and so they understand how some things work. And so I can't overemphasize how critical that role is. And so I think that a lot of hard thinking is going to go into who that might be.
Yeah, the other part of that is that role is the face of negotiating with the other parties, and so temperament and tone is going to very much matter in this instance. So they're going to miss Ralph Goodale even more.
Yeah, that is something Liberals have been saying in the city since the Goodale defeat. But speaking of the Goodale defeat, is a nice segue, David, because Saskatchewan and Alberta, they're black holes for the Liberals right now. Yeah. I mean, every single Liberal on the ballot was rejected by voters out there. Quick thoughts from both of you. Just what does he do? What does the Prime Minister do to deal with that situation?
Well, I'm of the view that he frankly should not try to overcome that political deficit by appointing somebody as sort of a super envoy to the West or to those two provinces. I think that kind of window dressing will always fall flat. I was hoping that Jim Carr could, for example, take on perhaps a stronger role, but now of course we know that he's ill, and we hope that it turns out well for him and he's able to perform. But he would have been sort of my go-to person, on that. So I think they have to just recognize they don't have the representation, but they really have to look at, I think, two key portfolios: the energy portfolio or natural resources and the environment climate change portfolio, and make certain that they have somebody who can at least speak with Western Canada without sort of adding fuel to the fire.
Okay, Michelle, some thoughts on that?
Well, I agree that putting someone in from the outside I don't think is the way to go. I think it has to start from the top, from the Prime Minister's office, about instilling in every minister the importance of actually representing all of Canada. Ensuring that you're having some strong people in all of the offices, including the Prime Minister's office, who are from Western Canada, who can be a voice, and also just making sure that ministers understand that they're accountable for having some kind of a presence in Western Canada. And I think that David nailed it, that it's going to be really important that the person in the natural resources portfolio is someone who is ready and willing to get out there and spend some time out there and really talk to stakeholders and advance, what the government is doing, but also listen and take their views and views that come their way as constructive, and at least be considered.
Okay.
I also think the intergovernmental affairs portfolio. I mean, Dominic LeBlanc was put in, of course, and he's ill now too, but he was put in before to try to smooth things over about a year and a half ago with some, fractious federation. The same principle could hold true, and I would certainly look for perhaps a BC voice or a Manitoba voice to take on that role if Chrystia Freeland isn't available.
All right, great stuff there from both of you. Thanks so much, David McLaughlin and Michelle Cadario. Thank you. Welcome back to Power and Politics and the Power Panel. Jason Markusoff, Tiffany Gooch, Melissa Lantzman, and Françoise Boivin. Okay, we're going to talk about cabinet-making speculation. Jason, we know that former Deputy Prime Minister Anne McClellan is advising the minority Liberal government on its cabinet making. You may be on the short list to represent Alberta because of what happened on election night. What do you think the Prime Minister is going to do to deal with that black hole in the West that he's got to deal with?
I hope he doesn't pick me. I kind of like my job and don't want to have to play for one team or another. Thanks for the recommendation, David.
You got it, man.
And I think, I think that I don't hear the people in Alberta or Saskatchewan saying we need a voice from here, even though he didn't pick one. I think he's going to have to figure out a way around his regional black hole to pick somebody who can represent the West. As people in one of your previous segments said, the intergovernmental affairs portfolio is vital. I'd say even more vital is who he picks for environment minister, who he picks for natural resources minister. Jim Carr, the Winnipeg MP, was very respected, or quite respected here in that portfolio. It's unfortunate that he's unwell and won't be able to do something like that. Catherine McKenna there was a request from Jason Kenney last week publicly for Justin Trudeau not to put her into cabinet in environment, and I think that pretty much means he has to, or eat some crow. But we hear about what's his name, John Wilkinson up in Burnaby as a potential environment minister. I think that the name will matter. The name could send a shockwave into Alberta or send some calming things. But people out here are going to be much more so looking for action and the actual things that they say rather than who the person is.
So, Tiffany, we know we have the black hole in the West right now because everyone lost. I mean, what other messages does Trudeau need to show in picking his cabinet? They've sent strong signals. They're going to govern on a progressive agenda. They're going to move ahead with things that they think the majority of the Parliament supports, even in a minority situation. What do you expect to see from the Prime Minister and his next cabinet?
So I think that there's absolutely going to be an emphasis on the diversity of the cabinet as we've seen in the past, but diversity in many different definitions this time. And so I think there's quite a few folks intergenerationally that we'll see coming in to this cabinet, and sort of a little bit of a shift, I would say, between a very fresh group that came in last time and a little bit more of a functioning of folks with a little bit more experience in Parliament that could be coming in. I would also say there's going to be a need for folks that have an ability to reach across the aisle, folks who are partisan in the ways that they need to be, but can also navigate different level of waters in the work that will need to get done to make the changes that they're looking to make. Also trying to think too about the international standing of Canada, folks within his caucus who have relationships and have work that spanned outside of our borders, and thinking about what kinds of roles he'll have those folks in that are also forward-facing outside of Canada, and thinking about those roles too.
So the biggest forward-facing outside of Canada is Chrystia Freeland. And Melissa, we're hearing from a lot of senior Liberals that she may not return in foreign affairs, not due to a performance issue, but because of her performance. They want to deploy her talents domestically in a minority situation, and that's something that's under active consideration. Would that be a smart move by the Prime Minister to bring Chrystia Freeland home?
Look, I think in terms of any minority government, your government now becomes inward-looking rather than outward-looking, and I think that's a danger for Canada on the world stage, but one that the government needs to take seriously. So they've got to maintain the confidence of the House. They've got to make sure that people are in their seats on the right day at the right time to vote on legislation, so the government doesn't just accidentally fall, because that can certainly happen. With Minister Freeland, to put her in, intergovernmental affairs, sure, a strong minister, but telling Alberta that you're going to put the MP from University Rosedale in cabinet to represent your voice. I'm not sure.
From the West.
I'm not sure that that's necessarily the the action that the West is looking for. It looks like a PR plan. It looks like window dressing. And until the Prime Minister takes some actual action on showing Albertans that their economy matters and their issues matter, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, Francois, I was talking to a Liberal today, and they basically said representation is one issue, but results are really what the West wants to see. They said the West can smell BS. I can't spell it out because they're a family show. But, get the pipeline done, show competence on that. That would be the number one thing they could do.
And don't forget that in the previous cabinet, there were some ministers from Alberta. There was Ralph Goodale. There was a Minister Sohi, Ralph Goodale. They both lost. So in a sense, it's not a proof that things is going well just because you have a cabinet minister from your neck of the wood. So I do think it's going to be what the Prime Minister give them as mandate. What will be their number one priority in each portfolio. And we all know that with what is happening right now, maybe Quebec was the story of the campaign from the get-go because of Monsieur Legault. But I do think that this mandate, this 43rd Parliament is going to be all about the West and how it's being played inside the country and what type of attitude the Trudeau cabinet is gonna have. So I do think that he needs people that have the doigté, sorry, I don't have the word in English, but and I think we won't see that much changes from who was there right now. They might reduce it. I'm still not convinced he'll stay with the same amount of, same number of ministers because it is a minority government, but it's going to be gender parity, perfect, and try to balance as much as he can. And from the get-go, I said on this show, I think the Prime Minister will keep with maybe Ms. Freeland support as intergovernmental affair. He will take this portfolio for himself. He needs to show leadership.
Take which portfolio for himself?
The situation of the West, of how to solve this. He's going to be the voice of Parliament with Jason Kenney and others unsatisfied. I do strongly believe that it's going to be through the Prime Minister that this whole file will, and it might be the test of his future legacy if he has one.
Jason, do you think that will play well in the West for Justin Trudeau to take the lead on this? Because I know some Liberals I speak to here think that exposes him too much and he's become a little bit too much of a flashpoint.
Justin Trudeau does not play well out here. We spent about 6 weeks adjudicating that question. So I think it will matter who he delegates to be out here. Somebody who will be very important from his cabinet will be Bill Morneau, the finance minister. Not only because he was the purchaser of the pipeline and would be involved in any prospective sale to a First Nations group or whomever, but also because equalization and the fiscal federalism is going to be a big issue from Jason Kenney and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe.
Melissa, Tiffany, we're getting indications that Bill Morneau is likely to stay where he is, to sort of send a message of stability to the economy and to the markets. Good move, bad move? What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say good move. There's going to be a need for some continuity for the next little while, and this will be a very difficult budget to gain consensus across. And so putting a rookie or somebody in that role would be a bit of a mistake, and I could understand the need to ensure somebody that already has really strong relationships across industries, across stakeholders, has gone through these levels of consultations in the past, and perhaps already has some trust in some areas to be built from, rather than starting from scratch.
I think it's rare generally that you see a finance minister move after a 4-year term. I think you generally see that going into the next term. I don't know necessarily if it's confidence of Bay Street, but it does ensure some kind of stability, or at least dealing with somebody that they already know.
When the Liberals return to power on Parliament Hill, they'll be faced with a new and challenging reality. Under minority rule, they'll have to lean on opposition parties to get legislation through Parliament. The NDP is the Liberals' most likely bedfellow, so does that worry Canada's business community? John Manley is a senior business advisor with the law firm Bennett Jones. He's also the former president and chief executive officer of the Business Council of Canada and former Liberal deputy prime minister. He joins me now from Toronto. Mr. Manley, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure, David.
There have been some questions raised about how the Liberals are going to function right now. They've got a minority government, no seats in Alberta, no seats in Saskatchewan, and likely have to rely on the NDP to hold on to power. What kind of a challenge does this create for the Prime Minister?
Well, I think the good news for the Prime Minister is that nobody else really can afford or wants an election right now. The other parties are going to deal with leadership turmoil and financial challenges. And so my guess, David, is that he'll pretty much govern as if he had a majority. It won't be smooth sailing because he will not control any of the parliamentary committees. So expect lots of disruption there. But in the meantime, I think he'll proceed with his agenda. He's got to show that he can govern.
They're already, I would say this generation of Liberals is a little bit more on the left side of the spectrum than your generation of Liberals, Mr. Manley, and now they need to rely on the NDP. How do you think the business community is going to react to that dynamic?
Well, it depends what they do. I can't say that the Liberal majority government was particularly pro-business in its attitudes or the things that it did. And of course, in much of Canada's business community, there are real concerns about how we continue to attract the capital that's necessary to build and expand our businesses, given that we've lost our tax advantage with the United States, given that there are regulatory obstacles in many Canadian jurisdictions to getting major projects built, and given that there's overall in the broad investment community kind of a sell Canada attitude.
So what do you think the Prime Minister should do there? I mean, is it cabinet calibration? Is it policy calibration? What kind of steps could he take early to send a signal to the business community?
Well, he did get out the day or two days after the election to signal that he intends to get his pipeline built, the one that he owns. That's going to be a very important signal that he shows that he will follow through in that, despite the fact that the NDP and the Greens remain opposed to it. So that's an important, very first indicator. He needs to look at the regulatory barriers that exist in Canada to getting projects done. That's not just the major pipeline projects, but many other issues that arise because of overlapping and duplicating of regulations, the need to get consultations done in a timely fashion. I don't think businesses object to consultations either for environmental or Indigenous reasons, but they need to be reasonably confident that if they do all the right things and accommodate all the right concerns, that they can get projects from the planning stage to the actual implementation stage. And then just look at the morass of regulation that burdens Canadian business. Steps on these issues could make Canada a more attractive place for investment to come.
You mentioned the pipeline. I was speaking with a senior Liberal today who said, look, the best thing we can do to signal to the West is just get that pipeline done, show some competence on that, and that would be the biggest step they could perhaps take in the short term towards dealing with Western alienation. Is that how you view it, or is there other things they need to do beyond the immediate progress on the pipeline?
Well, that's the first and most obvious one, and I'm glad to hear that they're talking that way. But of course, you mentioned the obstacle that they face in having no representation in the House of Commons from two major provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta. I think it's a good sign that the Prime Minister is waiting until November 20th. It means that he's actually grappling with this issue of representation. There are models that have been used in the past, of course, quite commonly using the Senate to appoint people to important portfolios where there was no representation. Stephen Harper did that. Other Liberal governments have done it in the past. Mr. Chrétien did it when I was there with respect to Nova Scotia, where we were shut out. And so I think that's a possibility. Could somebody cross the floor, as David Emerson did, or a generation or two ago, Jack Horner, who crossed to join Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government, an Albertan rancher who it was said after he made that change that even his horse wouldn't look him in the eye. It's a challenging thing for someone to do, but maybe there are some who would consider doing it.
What advice would you give him on cabinet? I know you just said that you didn't think this government as a majority was pro-business. The indications we get is that Bill Morneau is going to stay put in finance. Is that a good move? What would you recommend that Justin Trudeau does?
I don't think that the business community would look at any other possible finance minister as being a signal of the government moving to a more pro-business stance. I don't think that Bill Morneau has been massively popular in the Canadian business community, but they know him, they respect him for sure, and they respect his ability and his knowledge of the issues. So I think that they would welcome him staying. I think that they will look at some of the other key portfolios, including innovation, science and economic development, transportation, the environment, and see what kind of voices come from those portfolios.
So they want to see more action there, a more pro-business voice in those other, I don't want to call them second-level economic portfolios, but they're secondary to finance, right?
Having been the minister of what was then industry for 7 years, I didn't consider it second level at all. but no, you know, and the other thing I'd say is that it's not that people are looking for them to be pro-business. They're looking for a sense that there are ministers who actually understand the challenges that they're facing, that they're not, you know, fat cats sitting on tons of capital just deciding, you know, when and where they'll deploy it, that they're actually in a global competition to attract capital to Canada. And if they're in the export businesses, they're in a global competition to sell their goods to other countries in the world. And they want the feeling that the government understands that jobs are not created in Canada by governments, by and large. They're created by business, and business wants a partner in government that understands the challenges that they're facing.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.